All right. Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. All right. Now, unfortunately, I don't really give speeches. I give lectures. And it's usually bad news. But this one's going to end with a little speechifying and positivity in about an hour. So you can look forward to that. And this speech is dedicated to Dr. Ron Paul, who did so much to inspire liberty in the hearts of so many people. Let's hear it for him. All right, now, the story today is something I touched on in the speech last year. It was, the final part of it. We're going to zoom in a little further on the war in Yemen. And we have real good news about a possible end to that war. Emphasize possible. But there is a ceasefire now. We're in the third month of a ceasefire, and there's ongoing negotiations. And we'll get to a little bit more of that. But there's an advantage to press and something positive to talk about on this subject other than just lamenting the horror of it all, which we're going to do some of that too. But first of all, it would be fair if some of you didn't even know that we were at war in Yemen. It's a war as bad as Iraq War II, but as the Obama people called the war in Libya, they said, we're leading from behind, which is not really true, but it's essentially diffusing responsibility and pretending the war is somebody else's problem. They call it the Saudi-led coalition, except that America's the world empire and Saudi Arabia is our client state. And there's not one person in 7 billion on the earth who misunderstands that relationship. It's just that's the way that they try to characterize the thing to make it seem like it's less America's war than somebody else's. But as we'll see here, it's every bit America's war. It's every bit as bad as Iraq War II. It deserves to be as well known, on the minds of Americans the way Iraq was in 2006, something like that. And it's not fair that it ain't. And honestly, guys, it would be fair if some of you didn't even know where Yemen was. Yemen is the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, just across the Horn of Africa from the gates of the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandeb it's called. And so obviously the Arabian Peninsula, the entire thing is tilted towards the northwest there, but we're talking about that southern corner. And also, when we talk about the war, I'll be doing a lot of kind of north, south, and central for you. And so just keep in mind that even though Yemen is a rectangle long ways, we're talking mostly about the far west, or the western half of the country. And the eastern half of it is almost all barren desert and very small towns and mostly irrelevant to our story. So just so that you have in your mind's eye where it is in the world we're even talking about killing all these people. All right, so our story really begins in 2009 when Barack Obama becomes president, and he orders the CIA to really focus on, which, imagine that, 7 years into the war on terrorism, I want you guys to kill some Al-Qaeda guys, as opposed to whoever else you've been chasing around. So what he meant by that was the last 29, we know now, John Kiriakou, the former CIA officer, whistleblower, told me himself, they're going after 29 Al-Qaeda guys in Pakistan. It was a horrible war in Pakistan in the name of that. Killed tens of thousands of people, and that's a whole other speech. But the other side of that was the war against AQAP in Yemen. Now, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, as opposed to, say, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, you might hear on TV, oh, Al-Shabaab, they're Al-Qaeda linked. Yeah, well, that can mean a lot of things or maybe nothing at all. It's a Sunni with a rifle, Al-Qaeda linked. A Saudi gave him a sack of gold coins one time. He's Al-Qaeda linked. Okay. But AQAP, those are real Al-Qaeda guys. Those are the guys that bombed the USS Cole in the year 2000. The father-in-law of one of the Flight 77 hijackers that hit the Pentagon ran what was called the switchboard house there. Where they relayed messages back and forth between the Al-Qaeda leaders hiding in Afghanistan and their contacts in Europe and the United States, and were involved, therefore, in the plotting of September 11th. And then, of course, in the years since the terror war began, they're famous for the underpants bomber, who you might remember tried to blow up a plane over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009, which luckily he was inept, and his bomb, other passengers stopped him essentially from succeeding. But you can imagine what an absolute catastrophe that would have been. And there were also 2 other major cartridge bomb plots, or package bomb plots, where they tried to blow up American planes over the Pacific, both of which luckily failed. They also were involved in, I believe it was at least 2, if not 3, of the major massacres that took place in Europe in the 2000 teens there in Brussels. And I know they did the Charlie Hebdo attack on essentially the Mad magazine of Paris there, of France there in Paris, as well as the Angels of Death Metal concert massacre. Essentially machine gun massacres by these Al-Qaeda guys. And there was also an attack in Nice, France, which was a truck attack on a public walkway, which I believe could have been one of the AQAP ones, I forget, but pretty close. Right all in that era, they were behind 3 or 4 of those. So these are real Al-Qaeda terrorists and dangerous ones. But so Obama sends the CIA to kill them, and essentially that means a drone war. And as you guys could, just predict without knowing anything about it, this is completely counterproductive and horrible. They killed innocent civilians. You might remember from the time they talked about drones, they would say a drone is a scalpel, and a 500-pound bomb or a Hellfire missile, that's a surgical strike. And you do have to admit that taking out one pickup truck full of men is different than sending the entire 3rd Infantry Division in, like W. Bush did in Iraq War II, right? But the problem is, to our government, this is a sliding scale of evil that, in their mind's eye, means that we can get away with this, right? This is just reach out and touch someone, and so what's the worst that could happen? But of course, in real life, a 500-pound bomb, imagine a 500-pound bomb coming through the roof and killing all the people in this place. That's not a surgical strike. And then that means that brothers and fathers and cousins and nephews pick up arms and join the fight. That's insurgent math in the words of General Stanley McChrystal, the architect of our counterinsurgency policy, or, well, implementer of it anyway. He said that for every 2 insurgents you kill, you get 20 more. And so the whole goal, as he put it in the war in Afghanistan, was heroic restraint, they called it, so as to not wage the war in a counterproductive way. Now, of course, that didn't work in Afghanistan. The whole thing was counterproductive anyway. But at least they were acknowledging that when you kill innocent civilians, it may be along with someone you were targeting, guilty or not, that's not just taking a bad guy off the board. It might be adding a bunch of bad guys to the board. And in the case of the war against AQAP in Yemen, it was just like watering Al-Qaeda's garden with blood. And just more and more Al-Qaeda terrorists grew up. And this went on for a few years. Now, in order to get away with this, Barack Obama was paying the dictator of Yemen, a guy named Abdullah Saleh. And he had essentially consolidated power. It had been split in the days of the Cold War, with the South allied with the Soviet Union. But he united the country between North and South back in the days of H.W. Bush, and America had supported him as dictator ever since then. So Barack Obama is continuing that policy, but he's explicitly increasing the bribes and the aid to the guy in order to get away with the drone war, which I should have mentioned is taking place primarily in the south of the country, where the Al-Qaeda type forces are. So Saleh is taking all of Obama's money and guns, and he's waging his own separate battle against a group of Shiites in the north called the Houthis. That's a family and tribal and political designation. They're Zaydi Shiites, which are actually very close to the Sunnis, but are essentially a separate sect, and they're from this mountainous region in the Sada province up near the Saudi border. And so Saleh is attacking them over and over again. And every time he attacks them, it's also completely counterproductive. And they are getting more and more powerful in response to his failed assaults, 5 or 6 of them ultimately, as they continue to push him back. Now, all this time, Saleh is actually playing a double game. and he is paying the Al-Qaeda guys and their allies in the Muslim Brotherhood. In Yemen, the Muslim Brotherhood is known as the Al-Islah Party. And he's paying them to work with his army to go and fight against the Houthis. At the same time, he's accepting American money to let Obama bomb these guys. But it's worse than that. He's actually playing a triple game because he is funding his enemies, the Houthis in the north, and arming them against his own military and the Al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood guys that he's stabbing us in the back to back against them, because he's worried that his army is getting too powerful and they need to be diminished a little bit. So you think American politics is backstabby. This is, in Yemen, they have these curved daggers on their belt. As the saying goes, that's so if somebody's standing behind you, you can still stab them in the back. And that's how they do it. And so that was the game that Saleh was playing. But then, let me check my notes, make sure I'm not skipping anything. I am. So I wanted to mention about the drone war. I'm sorry, I skipped this about the drone war, but I shouldn't have. It's important. That Admiral Dennis Blair, he was the director of national intelligence, and he actually resigned. This did not get much publicity, but he resigned over the drone war. And, you know, he's a 4-star admiral. And he protested, and he went on, I think it was Face the Nation. And he talked about how you have to understand how much this enrages people to kill them with robots like this, where, you know, war is not supposed to be fair. You're supposed to destroy the other guy from over the horizon if you can. But here we're talking about people hiding in trailers in New York State and in Nevada who are literally hiding behind the entire diameter of the earth from the people that they are targeting and killing. And to the people on the ground, I mean, if you're being bombed by a B-1 bomber, at least it's conceivable that the plane could run out of gas or have engine trouble. The guy might have to, there's somebody there responsible. In this case, they're being essentially slaughtered by droids and driven then to more extreme terrorism in response to that kind of frustration. You can imagine what it would be like really to have killer robots prowling the skies in your neighborhood on a constant basis. And this is the same thing in Pakistan. It drives people out of their minds. There was even a Washington Post article, if you could believe it, one time, where the whole first half of the article was about the poor Israelis have no choice. But then the second half of the article was about the terror of being a little kid growing up in the Gaza Strip with Israeli drones over your head all the time. And sometimes people are just vaporized at random, seemingly, and you never really know. And, you know, kids in Pakistan growing up, they're afraid, terrified of the sunshine and the blue sky, because that's when people get killed all the time. And so the only time they feel safe to even run from one house to the other is if it's raining or overcast and the drones aren't out. So that's the kind of hell that the Americans are bringing to people's lives. And then, again, they call it the surgical strike and a scalpel operation and this kind of thing. But it seems very much the opposite of that to the people on the receiving end of it. And here, Admiral Blair resigned over it. So we should not be doing this. You have to understand how ultimately counterproductive this is for American security. You might as well be, if you had a program to create anti-American terrorism, this might be what it looks like. Should not be doing this. Leon Panetta, who was the head of the CIA and the Secretary of Defense, was asked on Meet the Press, geez, we're hearing that this is all counterproductive in creating more terrorists against us. And Panetta stammered and just said, you know, these are the tools that we have to use, and so we use them. And then that was his answer. And so it continues. All right. Now, in 2011 comes the Arab Spring. You might remember it really started with the Manning leak and the revolution in Tunisia. And then after they succeeded in overthrowing the American-backed dictator in Tunisia, the people of Egypt said, wow, you can do that? And then they went outside and they overthrew their dictator too. And then the people of the entire Middle East had these day of rage protests. Essentially, every government in the Middle East is a despotism, either El Presidente or a military dictator of one kind or another, or a king, an emir, or a sultan, or, you know, some pretended authority like that. So whether they're American puppets or not, and virtually all of them were, with the exception of Iran and Syria. The rest of them were American, client states at least. There were protest movements against all of them. And when the Arab Spring came to Yemen, what happened was you had all factions on the Egyptian model come together peacefully in the town square of the capital city of Sana'a and say, we want a new government. We want to overthrow this dictator, and we're going to have a constitutional convention and a parliamentary system and all of this. And you had the Houthis came from the north, and the socialists came from the south, and the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't know if the Al-Qaeda guys came, but the Al-Islah faction came, and they were ready and willing to work together to do this. But Abdullah Saleh didn't want to go. Then somebody tried to kill him twice. And on the second one, it was a bombing attempt, and he was wounded. So he had to go to Saudi Arabia to convalesce, to be treated. So while he was gone, this is in, I guess, early 2012. So while he's gone in Saudi Arabia, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton swoops in with the Saudis, and they decide, we're going to get rid of this guy. And instead of letting the people of Yemen have their way and create a new constitutional system of whatever form that they can compromise on, we're going to do it our way. We're going to get rid of Saleh, and we're going to replace him with his vice president, Mansour Hadi. And Saleh then, he didn't die, he got better, and he went away mad. And he went up north and made an alliance with his old enemies, the Houthis. It turns out that he's a Zaydi Shiite, just like them, even though he wasn't a Houthi and a member of their political faction. He turned around and made friends with them. After all, he'd been supporting them kind of behind his own army's back for a while there anyway. The relationship was there. And so instead of retiring to his farm, he brought 2/3 of the army with him and went away mad and went up north. Now, during this time, Hadi is a terrible dictator. He inherits the power, but he doesn't have any of the shared, compromises and deals for power that Saleh has made and engineered over the decades. So he's trying to lord it over everyone, but he doesn't have it to lord. So his policies just continue to backfire. He refused to hold new elections. Oh, did I mention? He was the only name on the ballot. They held a bogus election. They literally, and you can find this even on NPR News website. You can find the picture of it. If you just, anyone on your phone, you can look at it. Just type in Saleh ballot and put that in your Google images. And you'll see one man, one face, one name on the ballot, one oval to fill in. And that's it. And Hillary Clinton hailed that as the advent of Yemeni democracy, of course. And so Hadi was just a bumbling fool and was not able to compromise. And he continued he allowed the CIA to continue the drone war in the south. And then he continued to attack the Houthis in the north. And then at one point, and he refused to stand for election against any opponents of any kind. And then he tried to institute a strong federalism program, which essentially meant drawing like state lines where before there were just regions. And this would have meant cutting the Houthis off from their access to the Red Sea. And so to them, that was it, final straw, and they started marching on the capital city, and they sacked it and ran Hadi out of power at the end of 2014. Now, once the Houthis take over the country, the Americans, and by Americans I mean our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who is then the 4-star general commander of Central Command, he made a deal with the Houthis. He said, oh, you guys hate Al-Qaeda guys? And they said, yeah, of course we do. To Al-Qaeda, the only good Shiite is a dead Shiite, so they have a real interest in fighting Al-Qaeda. And so this is in the Wall Street Journal and Al-Monitor from January of 2015. And in the case of Al-Monitor, what happened was Barbara Slavin was attending, this great reporter was attending a meeting at the Atlantic Council where the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, Michael Vickers, came and gave a presentation and mentioned this. And then she followed up with him and asked him about it, got follow-up questions after the thing was over. And he explained that, yes, we're passing intelligence to the Houthis, this new group, this rebel group that's taken over the capital city of Sana'a, because they like killing Al-Qaeda guys. And so we're giving them intelligence, and they're using it, and it's working. And then the Wall Street Journal had not only that story, but they also had reporters in Yemen who were verifying from the Houthi end that, yes, we are receiving this intelligence from the Americans and we're using it very effectively. Thank you very much. Now, as I said, the drone war against Al-Qaeda was horribly counterproductive. There's no reason for any of us to believe that a Houthi war against them would have been effective, or that even if it were, that would be a reason for anyone in this room, including me, to support that. But at least, in this case, they're targeting the people who've been targeting Americans and killing them, including 3,000 American civilians on September 11th, so it's something. But then 2 months later, in March of 2015, Barack Obama stabbed the Houthis in the back and he took Al-Qaeda's side against them. And that was because the Saudis were mad that the Houthis had taken over the capital of Sana'a. And the Saudis demanded that Obama take their side in a war to roust the Houthis out of there. Now, the Houthis didn't have the power to just institute a Shiite dictatorship over the whole country or something like that. As soon as they came in, they started negotiating with all the other factions. They were going to create, I swear to God, they were going to create a bicameral Congress with a lower house that was dedicated to women and the youth so that they would have their representation. And then in the upper house would be the men from the different factions around the country. They were ready to share power and make peace. It was workable. And then the bombs started falling. And Barack Obama took their side, the Saudi side, against the people of Yemen and the Houthis, essentially because, as you might remember, in the spring of 2015, he was working hard on negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. And the Saudis were pissed. Now, you might wonder, why would the Saudis be pissed? If the worry, allegedly, is that Iran is going to make a nuclear bomb, and Barack Obama is making a deal that includes which he did, that includes the Iranians pouring concrete into the heart of their heavy water reactors and scaling back their nuclear program and expanding their inspections regime beyond any in world history, then if you were a Saudi military man, it seems like you would be pretty happy with that, right? Barack Obama is protecting our security by working to doubly ensure that the Ayatollah is not making nukes across the Gulf. So what's the problem? The problem was this stupid, mistaken fear on the part of the Saudis that Obama doing this nuclear deal with Iran meant that America was ready to abandon Saudi Arabia and tilt back toward the Persians like it was in the old days. Well, come on, man. That is just not in the cards, okay? You guys remember, this was every bit of political capital that Barack Obama had. Netanyahu came and spoke to the Congress at the invitation of members of Barack Obama's own party and the Republicans to denounce this deal and try to stop him. All he was doing was taking the threat of war over the alleged danger of Iran's nuclear program off the table. He was not putting a new strategic alliance with Iran on the table, not by a million miles. But that was the fear in Saudi Arabia, that their place as the kingpin of the American-dominated world order in the Middle East was at stake. And so the Saudi royals said to the American emperor, prove your loyalty to us by helping us bomb this group, the Houthis, in Yemen. And it was Barack Obama's own people told this to the New York Times. This was not some scoop. This was, based on 17 White House sources speaking to the New York Times. He said they knew that the war would be long, bloody, and indecisive, but they had to do it to placate the Saudis, who were upset about the Iran nuclear deal. And of course, upset that George Bush had given Baghdad to Iran's best friends a few years before that as well. But that was their words, long, bloody, and indecisive, which, not to be too deconstructionist about it, but let's deconstruct that just a little bit. Long means that, well, geez, why'd you name it Operation Decisive Storm? What do you mean long? You're going to embark on a war against this weak regime, this brand new weak regime, but you don't really have a plan to oust them, do you, then? And then what's bloody mean? Bloody means they're going to be killing people. They're going to be exploding them to death with high explosives, tearing them to little pieces. And then, the people on the outskirts of the bombing, they'll just lose a couple limbs and bleed out and die of that. We're talking about absolute horror show, Wes Craven nightmare stuff. Right? And indecisive. Operation Decisive Storm will be indecisive, the White House tells the New York Times on the record. Which means what? That means that they don't even know what victory is supposed to look like. They don't even know what they're doing. They just want Mohammed bin Salman to shut up. And who's Mohammed bin Salman? In 2015, he's the 29-year-old brand new defense minister and deputy crown prince of Saudi Arabia. And of course, this is his war. He launched it, as a public choice theory expert would explain to you, for his own personal political interests inside the Saudi royal family. And some of you heard this did make the news. He led a massive purge of the different factions. There are 3 or 4 major branches of the Saudi royal family, and he locked up the principals of the other 3, including the serving crown prince, his cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef, and had him arrested and locked in a closet somewhere and took his place as crown prince. And his father is, a senile old man in his 80s, and he's the de facto king of Saudi Arabia. We'll probably be stuck with him for decades at this rate. And he used the launching of this war to do it. This guy that, they know him as Crown Prince Bonesaw for murdering and cutting up the corpse of this Washington Post writer, Jamal Khashoggi, who's the nephew of Anand Khashoggi, the famous gun runner from the Iran-Contra days, for those of you who like trivia. See, I knew there was a laugh line in here somewhere. All right, so when they launched this war, what does it mean then that it's America's war too exactly? That means that America has supported the Saudi and United Arab Emirates effort with endless supply of as many F-15s as they need. The British, of course, participate. About 1/4 to 1/3 of their Air Force are British Typhoons. The rest are American F-15s. So the British are playing their same role there. But they use all of our contractors to do all of the maintenance on the planes, endless supply of munitions coming in from America all the time for all the resupply. You think those princelings, take care of the care and feeding of their fighter jets? That's all Americans doing that. And it's, whoa. And it's American intelligence officials, as long as somebody's taking care of that. And it's American intelligence officials who are responsible for, and this includes military and civilian officials and contractor, mercenaries, of course. I mean, all of the, I'll stop for the sound. Go ahead. They're providing all of essentially the logistics and the intelligence gathering, the targeting. So that means everything from the air traffic control and all the planning of the whole war. The Saudis don't do this. The Americans do it all for them. And the Washington Post actually just did a study that they released where they directly attributed and proved it, that all of these Saudi princelings are being trained, of course, by Americans to fly these planes. And the Post showed here's where they trained, even in America and over there. So essentially the entire war is dependent on the United States of America. If Barack Obama had told them no, then they would have said, drats, we'll have to figure out something else, right? Or they would have had to dump more money into Al-Qaeda then or something like that. They would not have been able to carry out the war this whole time if it wasn't for the American constant resupply and effort to coordinate the entire war for them. And it's treason. And really, as I said, Obama was taking Osama bin Laden's side when he switched sides in this war. It wasn't just that he stopped supplying the Houthis with intelligence to target them. It's that the Saudis and the UAE took Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula under their wing and made them one of their militias. And I swear this is true, I got all the footnotes in enough already, well, in the text anyway, they took control of 7 towns, including the major city of Mukalla, and they seized entire tax bases, billions of dollars, and they cut everybody's taxes, but they're still raking it in. I mean, the previous mobsters were taking so much. I think they like dropped all tariffs at the port, but raised sales taxes or something like that, and just made a killing. And they seized entire military bases and weapons magazines, and they ruled something like 7 towns. And this went on for the first 2 or 3 years of the war until essentially the Americans got on the UAE's case, because the UAE was supporting them, and said, this is just too bad of public relations for us. Never mind, these guys helped coordinate 9/11 and tried to sink our battleship, but this looks bad. So could you please do something about it? And so then the UAE went in and wiped them out. No, I'm just kidding. The UAE went in there and hired them all and integrated them into their militia. And we've been flying as their Air Force this whole time. And I'm telling you what, man, in March of 2015, the great Pentagon reporter, the late great Pentagon reporter, my friend Mark Perry, wrote a piece where he interviewed an expert from the Jamestown Foundation named Michael Horton, no relation to me, who's a real expert on Yemen and all about these different political and armed factions and everything about it. And this is in 2015, so we're at the height of the Iraq War III, the anti-ISIS war in Iraq. And so Michael Horton says to Mark Perry, he says, you know, John McCain complains that we're flying as Iran's Air Force in Iraq, which is true, and of course, it's all John McCain's fault for supporting Iraq War II and Iraq War III in the first place. But anyway, Iraq War II, the dirty war in Syria, and Iraq War III. But John McCain complains that we're flying as Iran's Air Force in Iraq right now. Well, we're flying as Al-Qaeda's Air Force in Yemen. And that was the first month of the war. That was from the very beginning, on the record from one of the most qualified experts. You can find plenty of war hawks will cite Michael Horton on other issues because he's a world-renowned expert in this stuff, telling you from the very beginning, this war is high treason. And so now the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Islah, is also fighting on the same side as the Al-Qaeda forces in this, in what they call the Giants Brigade, the UAE's militia. And even CNN, during Barack Obama times, they weren't ratting on Donald Trump, who did support this all the way through, but this was even during Barack Obama times. The CNN did a report about how the Al-Qaeda guys are driving around in American MRAP armor personnel carriers and carrying American rifles and, you know, other light arms. And this is not the case, as CNN clarified. This is not like when ISIS seized all the weapons we'd left behind in western Iraq, or as we saw last summer, when the Taliban seized all the weapons that we left behind in Afghanistan for the Afghan army. This wasn't like that. These were weapons the UAE had just given them, that the UAE had bought from America, their ally. Because America was on Al-Qaeda's side in the war. It's as simple as that. Now, let me check see how I'm doing on time here and make sure. Oh, I'm good. So now the excuse for this, it couldn't possibly be considered a reason. The excuse given for this is that Iran backs the Houthis. And the truth is that they're friends. I don't even say they're really allies now. It was in 2019, so 4.5 full years into the war, before the Ayatollah invited, and I don't even think the Ayatollah showed up, I think it was just the president of Iran, invited the chief of the Houthi tribe to go to Tehran to shake hands and recognize the Houthis as the sovereign government of Sana'a. So these are presumably, you know, their best friends in the world. But of course, the country's under, oh, and I'm sorry I left this out on the support, is the American Navy's blockade. You know, the Saudis don't have much of a navy, and it's the American Navy that's enforcing the blockade on Yemen. So how are the Iranians even supposed to get them more than just, you know, the kind of small light arms that you can ship on small boats and, you know, wire transfers of money and this kind of thing. But other than that, there's not much material support they can even give them. You might remember when Nikki Haley did, when she was Donald Trump's UN ambassador, she did a big presentation with a big missile, and she said, this missile is, we can prove this is an Iranian missile that was given to the Houthis by Iran recently, and that was just a lie. And it was Jane's Defense Weekly that pointed out that, no, that's just not true. Iran and Yemen bought these missiles from North Korea around the same time, and we can tell that this is just, these are all Yemeni modifications to North Korean rockets. These are not the kind of modifications that the Iranians did that were totally different, et cetera, like that. So Jane's Defense Weekly is the Bible of the defense industry, you know, publication, the authoritative source on that. That rocket is, there's just no Iran in that chain of custody, and there's not even an indication of one. They're just blowing smoke and hoping you buy it, which happens a lot when it comes to Iran and their role in the Middle East. And what a poor excuse anyway. So the Houthis, let's say the Houthis, you know, rule Yemen for the next 50 years. I mean, they have not lost the war in 7 years. So what does that really mean? That Iran is going to fully militarize the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and no one's going to be, and then they're going to, what, close the Red Sea to shipping? And the rest of the world, including the U.S. Navy, that rules all the oceans and the 7 seas, is going to let them get away with that? Does anybody think that that's true at all? That we need to have a regime compliant with American wishes in Somalia and Djibouti and Yemen forever and ever just because we like sailing ships through there? It's completely crazy. The idea that that would be the status quo for what, the indefinite future, that the middle part of North America guarantees the gates of the Red Sea. And even if we had to, we could do so with a couple of battleships. And there's no indication whatsoever that the Ayatollah is so ambitious whatsoever anyway. The whole thing is just an excuse, and a poor one. And as some of you, I'm sure have heard, this really is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. It has been for 7 years. And part of the reason for that is even when the war began, this is the poorest country in the Middle East. They have very little in the form of oil resources. And what oil wealth they did have was squandered by their former dictator, the American puppet Saleh, in previous times. And not only that, but the IMF and the World Bank had gangsterized the Yemenis out of growing their sustenance crops like sorghum and millet and other grains, and instead encouraged them to just grow cotton and coffee for the world market. Welcome to global capitalism. It's great. You'll be eating Florida oranges and Brazilian steaks, and what have you got to lose? Sell your cotton. It's, straight out of Adam Smith and Ricardo and all of that, right? Your comparative advantage. Until the U.S. Navy puts you under blockade and closes you off to all imports. And they were importing 80-something% of their food, between 80 and 90% of their food when the war began. And so then the Americans just completely shut them off to trade. And from the very beginning months of this war, the international aid organizations were just screaming their heads off that you can't do this. Figure out another way, because these people are going to starve to death. You just can't. And it's been like this the whole time. And there's no question that in the violence of the war, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. But that in the deprivation from the war, from the starvation and from the people dying of otherwise easily treatable diseases, but because they're malnourished and so forth, they die of common colds and things like this. And especially, of course, we're talking about children and the elderly. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, better than 500,000. And I've been following this pretty closely, and I'm no epidemiologist, but I know a couple. And I think that it's pretty clear that by the time this whole thing is over and they do the excess death rate comparison, that we'll see that more than 1 million people have died in this thing. And that includes some of the worst, I guess, 3 of the worst cholera outbreaks in recorded history, which means since World War II, I guess. And that includes the cholera outbreaks that were deliberately inflicted on Iraq by Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, by the way, which were horrible. But the thing is with cholera, it's a bacterial infection, and you don't even really need antibiotics. You just need clean water. But they don't have any clean water. And that's because the Saudis, that is American F-15s with Saudi pilots, bombed their waterworks, bombed their electricity, bombed the sewage, bombed, every government building, every civil service type operation, bombed the marketplace, bombed the car dealership, bombed the food processing facilities, bombed the farms, they bombed the grain silos, they bombed flocks of sheep in the field, horses in their stables, bomb all the tractors. They're just flying around all day long, loitering, looking for things. And they decided from the beginning that they're going to target the very basic infrastructure of civilian life in the country. And so then babies die of cholera. Quite literally, that means they vomit and defecate themselves to death, when all they need is clean water to drink for a few days, and they'd have made it. And so that's the history of the world. It's already written. It's already done. And can't be undone. That's America's war in Yemen. And, well, this and then that. The Associated Press has done a ton of great work on the UAE's role in this war, including their torture prisons, where they torture people to death, rape them to death, and they have multiple witnesses on this. And honestly, guys, I would dismiss this if it was the regime accusing their enemies, but it's not. This is regime-friendly media reluctantly confessing the truth about our friends and allies, that they roast people to death on spits. The UAE does, to human beings. And those are our guys in this war, violating every part of the Geneva Convention. Like it doesn't have anything to do with it at all. Deliberately targeting the civilian population under, like LeMay's theory of burning Tokyo to the ground, that if you just kill enough civilians, eventually they'll quit, which is, the ethics of barbarianism, not civilization. And, unsurprisingly, well, I don't know, not predictably, still shockingly, the American, Saudi, UAE, Al-Qaeda war in Yemen has led to a massive locust plague in East Africa. And they finally only recently figured out what causes grasshoppers to turn into locusts. It's when their population is so thick that all the males' legs rub against each other when they're doing their cries, and that triggers the signal and converts them to locusts. And so friendly grasshoppers then become, this is biblical, right? A wipe out of civilization. What happened was, in Yemen, every year the graduate students at the university in Sana'a would go out and murder all the grasshoppers. And they had these massive eradication programs of poisoning them and trapping them and whatever it was and killing all the grasshoppers. But of course the war brought an end to the university and brought an end to the program, and there was nobody there to kill the grasshoppers. And so the grasshoppers turned into a massive locust plague that then wiped out whatever crops were growing, and then hopped across the Red Sea to the Horn of Africa and wiped out crops all throughout in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, where the poor Somalis have been under a war very comparable to what I've been describing to you this whole time about Yemen since 2001. That's another speech. I don't know the excess death rate on that. I don't know if anybody's caught up with that. It's certainly hundreds of thousands of people have died now of worse famine. I mean, they're already in the state of the most horrible drought, and then they have American interventionism to contend with as well, in the form of literal locust plagues. You couldn't make that up. And of course, these are people who have nothing to do with it, right? What do the people of Ethiopia or Kenya have to do with our war? Other than, of course, America backs the Tigray in Ethiopia. That's another speech too, but they're innocent bystanders, the people who are dying of this. The fighters are fed. It's the children and the old people who die of it. So now in 2017, Abdullah Saleh, the former dictator, made a mistake. Now, I'd been joking on my show, kind of joking, but half serious, that wait a minute, America and Saudi got along with this guy Saleh for 30 years. Now, he's getting along with his worst enemies, the Houthis. I think I see a compromise. Let's just bring Saleh back. And we're talking about a genocide going on here. It ain't perfect. How about we put his son in, or his right-hand man? 5? Oh, I misread my clock. So Saleh thought I was right. I don't know if he listened to the show or what, but instead of saying to the Houthis, let's do this, he tried to stab them in the back. What is his manner? His way of doing things. And he went to the Saudis and tried to make a secret deal with the Saudis behind the Houthis' back. And so they killed him first. And they kept their control of his army, and they rule the capital this day. Now, man, 5 minutes, huh? I better hurry now. Donald Trump kept us in the war for 4 years straight. He tore up the nuclear deal, kept the war anyway. Ask him why. He said, because the Saudis are spending $450 billion on weapons. Yeah, over the next 150 years they might. Spend about $3-4 billion a year on American weapons to do this. And at what price would you buy a genocide? Or could you sell one? But that was his excuse, was just keeping Raytheon happy, and he did. And Biden broke his promise. He came into power and he said, we're going to end all offensive support for the war. We'll help the Saudis shoot down incoming drones and missile attacks into Saudi Arabia, but we won't help them attack Yemen anymore. Well, that was 1.5 years ago, and he ain't called off a damn thing. The whole thing continued up until the ceasefire that broke out just over 3 months ago, just over 2 months ago, that the Americans did not broker. That was the United Nations and other factions that brokered that deal. And so they do have this Ramadan ceasefire, and they're now in the 3rd month of it, and there's real reason to be optimistic because the Saudis, importantly, have abandoned their primary goal of the war, which was to reinstall this guy Mansour Hadi in power. And they've now appointed this committee of guys and whatever. So that's a major climb down from the Saudis and an indication of their willingness to compromise now. And so this is the part where I get to the speechifying at the end, which is that there's something that we can do about it instead of just bemoaning it. Right now, just in the last 2 weeks, it's brand new, in the U.S. House of Representatives is a war powers resolution to force Biden to end American support for this war. And now here's the thing. I'm sure some of you guys can sympathize with this. It's been this really weird experience for me. I don't mean to sound negative, but it's important, I guess. The whole time I've been involved in libertarianism, for like 25 years, there's always been the movement, and then there's the party. And you have all these different, little institutes and bigger ones. There's, of course, Mises and Cato and the Future Freedom Foundation, the Independent Institute, and the Ron Paul Institute, and I got my little old Libertarian Institute as well. And there's, of course, 100,000 angry bearded young men on Facebook, and the Free State Project that obviously has been holding it down and setting a great example of what libertarian organized energy can accomplish for many years here, right? And then there's the Libertarian Party. And it's just kind of like our weird cousin that we don't really know, and we don't know anybody who's a member of it, and we're not really sure who these people are. And truthfully, in 2004, me and Anthony Gregory, which he's moved on to academia now, but he was a great libertarian polemicist there, especially in the Bush and early Obama years, and good friend of mine. And we went to the Libertarian Party convention in 2004, and we decided there that we're not going to do this. We're not going to join the party, and we're not going to try to have anything to do with it because it's just pissing up a rope. Who would bother? The thing is incorrigible, unfixable, and I'm just going to go back and do my show, and he's going to go and get to his keyboard and write his articles. And so now those days are over forever, because now the libertarian movement has finally taken over the Libertarian Party. And honestly, I keep thinking about it. I keep sinking in on different levels how important this is, how momentous this is, and it's never going back. And we own this thing now. We can do whatever we want with this thing now. And you know what's the first thing we're doing with this thing now? We're opposing the war in Yemen. That's what we're doing. So we got, something around 20 or 30,000 members of the party on that email list, involved in communication on Twitter, on Facebook. And we're trying to get everybody doing this thing together at the same time. I'm not asking you to all become just like me and be all anti-Yemen war activists for the rest of your life, but how about for the next 2 weeks? Can I get 2 weeks out of you? And you just make sure that you call 833-STOP-WAR, and they'll connect you right to your congressman's office. Tell them how you feel about it. Make sure, get your mom, get your wife and husband, boyfriend and girlfriend, your cousin Jimmy and your next door neighbor. And I mean, seriously, that sounds stupid, but it's real force multiplier. If every single person gets 5 other people to do this, and we're starting with 10, 20, 30,000 people, and plus all the members of the movement who aren't part of the party too, and we all do this together, we're talking about tens of thousands of calls to Congress. That really does matter. I know it matters. So I interview these activists who are up on Capitol Hill dealing with those people, and they say that it matters. And I was on a conference call the other day. They said the House staffers said to them, more calls, please. The calls help so much. I have to be able to say to the boss, the phone is ringing off the hook. The people really care. And then we can do it. We'll get the vote. But we got to make the calls. So it's really something that we can do. And I think it's a great trial for what is the potential of the Libertarian Party, not just to elect candidates, but to be engaged in politics in all levels, and especially on the most important issues first. And so please help and join. It's 833-STOP-WAR. They'll connect you right to your congressman. It's HJ Resolution 87, the War Powers Resolution to end the war in Yemen. Thank you.